is Alexander. Shabbat for three. Bingo!
Carter will get it for the win. Got it! He is hard to believe.
Here's Jordan.
Yes! The Magic, a 360 turn with the dribble. Magic down the middle. Gives underneath the Worthy. Slam dunk.
Third in the corner. Double fake.
But, yeah, so the physicality is very real. But then my friend Will, who I mentioned earlier, started talking about how good older players were one day during quarantine. And I started saying, like, bro, weren't you the one who were saying all those guys were weak? And he responded to my question saying that he was wrong. And that a friend showed him things that completely changed his perception of the game. And passed it on to me. He showed me a video titled, Why 60s Players Don't Display Handles on YouTube. I saw Jerry West seem to slightly fumble the ball to the point where it looked like a modern crossover, hand on the side of the ball. And he was called for a carry. And I watched it again and I was like, wait 1 second. It all makes sense now. The main reason players dribbling looks funny and unorthodox was because they weren't allowed to dribble like we do now. And when I say we, I mean youth levels, me learning how to play basketball. Hand on top of the ball at all times. Think of how many modern moves that eliminates when you have to abide by those rules. Any wide crossover, the hezzy cross, the between the legs pullback, all of that illegal. It totally changes how a guard can score compared to what we see now. The more you cup the ball, the more grip you have. Because think about it. Why does Magic Johnson dribble like that? Why does he, he's considered the greatest point guard ever and one of the best ball handlers ever. And you look at that and a kid would look at it now and think, he's not doing any fancy crossovers. He's dribbling with the right hand on the left side. Your average high school hooper, great high school hooper has more handles than him. Or Reggie Jackson has more handles than him. Think of how dumb that sounds for. Does that make sense to you? Because here's the thing. Jerry West lived in a different time. But he breathes the same air as I breathe right now. He's living in this world, walking around somewhere. He's not some evolved species. He's like your grandpa's age. So when your grandpa was a kid, yes, despite the fact that we didn't have iPhones and all this different stuff, putting the ball and making a wide crossover with the side of your hand isn't a scientific invention, guys. At all. So, it all makes sense. Dribbling changed somewhere in the 80s. I don't know if it was a written rule or something they just kind of let fly, but when you watch games from the early 80s, you see they still abide by the same dribbling rules as the 60s and 70s. But then you look in the later 80s, and you see the first person that I've seen doing wide crossovers, Isaiah Thomas. And that's why people see him as someone that's a real pioneer of the game and how it's changed. And then it all makes sense. Because I remember people used to say, was Allen Iversons' crossover a carry? And I remember thinking, I don't know why people even said that. Because carrying is when you put your hand under the ball, not when you put your hand on the side of the ball. But now I see why people used to question it. Because it was a carry. If Allen Iverson did that, if somebody did that in the 80s, and I've seen people do crossovers in those eras now that I've been watching, and they get called for carries. So no one really does it. There's a quote from Steve Kerr, too, just in case you don't believe me and you think that it's just because skill has evolved. And by the way, in 1996, at the height of the N1 mixtape era, people were questioning whether it was a carry, but the NBA saw how popular Iverson was and how people were enjoying those moves and thought, this style of dribbling is good for the game. And that's what people want. And thus, dribbling became that you can't have your hand under the ball. But other than that, it's fair game.
People are going to make comparisons, but I wonder today, with the rules having changed today, you can't hand check, you can't touch anyone, you can walk all over the place, you can carry the basketball all over the place. And this is the evolution of the game. If he could have added that to his game, my goodness, what would we see today?
So Steve Kerr has a quote by Clutch saying, Before Iverson, even though I technically pointed to Isaiah Thomas from what I've seen, but before Iverson, his move was a carry, and guys had to keep their hand on top of the ball. So he was groundbreaking with that move because it was a hesitation into a crossover that nobody had really done before. So that's the end quote.